Thanks for taking some time out of your day or night to check out this episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about this Paco SA-40 Integrated Amplifier, or as Paco called it in their literature, a preamplifier amplifier. I guess the integrated amplifier term was not thought up yet. Now this was made by Paco, and I hope my pronunciation of Paco is correct. I guess it could be Paco, but I will say Paco. This unit was made between 1959 to 1961, and Paco apparently manufactured some electronic kits, and I'm going to show you a copy of one of their ads that I found. On this particular amplifier, as well as some of their other gear. It came in either assembled form or a kit form. The price was $79.95 unassembled as a kit, or $129.95 as a fully assembled preamplifier. Now that would translate to between about $800 and $1,000 in today's money. It was rated at 40 watts per channel at not more than 0.5% THD, from 30 hertz to 50 kilohertz, I think, plus or minus 1 dB. And that 40 watts, I think, was total power between the two loads. So if it was a 4 ohm load, it would be 20 watts per channel into a 4 ohm load, or if it was an 8 ohm load, it would still be 20 watts per channel into an 8 ohm load, as best I can tell. I'm going to show you the front and then the kind of the top and the back of the unit, and there will be some data. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that this belongs to a buddy of mine, Ian. I had fixed it for him with the help of my woodworking genius friend that lives across the alleyway from me. Rich is his name, and he's also really good with tube stuff, and being how this has tubes, it was having a large hum problem. So while Rich was in town and available, I asked him to come over, and we started troubleshooting this unit. And apparently the person that Ian had gotten this from had added a fairly big, I believe it was a 5-watt resistor, a couple hundred ohms in series with the plus B filter supply. So it was developing a big AC voltage across that resistor, which was feeding back in the power supply and made an awful hum. And once that was figured out and some adjustments made, it seemed to work pretty good. It finally returned to Ian with a case that Rich made for it. He used it for a few days. He enjoyed it. He was running his phono into it, and then it stopped. At least one channel stopped, and he called me up. I suggested he test all the tubes. He did, and the two 7199 phase inverter tubes were bad. One of them was totally out. Now it turns out, once I got it, one of the resistors feeding one of those two tubes had burned open. Main problem is that they don't really make 7199 tubes anymore, and if you do find them, they are very expensive. Fortunately, there is a 6H8A or a 6U8A that is fairly easily swapped into the place of the 7199s. You have to do some rewiring of a tube socket. They do make tube adapters that will convert for the 7199 to the 6U8A. However, it may not fit if you have a shield over the tube, which these particular tubes do. So Ian asked me if I would wire it to run off the 6GHA, 6U8A, and I did that, and the data you will see is with the 6U8 or 6GHA tubes installed. I will also put up a picture showing the conversion that can be done to convert it, but you can search the internet and there are some good resources for converting the 7199 to a 6U8A or 6GHA tube. It's basically removing 3 wires. However, there are more than one thing connected to each of the wires that are moved, so it does take a little bit of work to get that modification done. I wanted to give a little upfront tour of the Paco SA-40. It has a bunch of different features on it. We'll start over here. Here's our power on-off switch. We also have our speaker switch, which is right here, so you can select either one set of speakers or another set of speakers, but not both at the same time. We also have something here called System 1 or System 2. I'm still not sure what that relates to, but I think it's related to the speaker switch that you're on. We also have a contour switch, which would be like a loudness control, and you'll see the effect of that in the data. And we also have a rumble switch to cut down the bass when playing records, and we'll see the effect of that. There is an RIAA equalization switch, which is right here, for either the US or European equalization curve. Here is your input. You do have two phono inputs. I would assume they're both moving magnet inputs, as well as a microphone input, a tape deck input, a tuner input, and two auxiliaries. So it has quite an array of inputs. You have your stereo, left, right, reverse switch stuff going on here. Your balance control, your loudness control, which is the volume control. I don't know why they call it loudness rather than volume, but it is a volume control. And here you have your bass and treble controls. There are two rings, one ring for the left channel and one for the right channel. And that's kind of the front of it. There's also a pilot light right here. It originally was a pilot light, and I just kind of have it taped down there and have an LED hooked up so that when the case is made for this, it will be in a spot on the case so we'll know that the power is on. So this is a rear view of the Paco SA-40, and a few things to point out. We have speaker output terminals here. It has taps for 32, 16, 8, and 4 ohm speakers. We also have a user replaceable fuse there. We have a switched AC outlet and an unswitched AC outlet. This guy right here is our power transformer, and these two transformers are for the speakers. We have 4 7199 tubes, and these are the bias control pots for each of the pairs of tubes. We also have a left preamp out and then a tape out for left and right channels. I don't know why there is no right preamp out, but the right preamp out would also be the tape out based on what I saw on the schematic. And we're going to come over above it now. So this is a little bit different view of the Paco SA-40, and I just wanted to point out the 5 tubes that are used in the preamp stage. These guys here, and we do have a plus B filter capacitor there. That actually was a replacement for the original one. Also, if we come over here, we can see our inputs, try to focus on them. So we have our 2 phono inputs, a tape head input, and a mic input, and then below those we have a tuner input and 2 auxiliary inputs. This obviously is the inside of the Paco SA-40, and I kind of just wanted to see all the capacitors that were replaced on the unit. Darn near all the caps have been replaced on it. Most of the resistors have been replaced. I did several replacements. The blue ones here and the blue ones here were all ones that I replaced. So somebody had been in it, and there's only a few caps or resistors that had not been replaced. This capacitor here, and there's another one down here. I don't know if we can see it. I'll lower that in a minute. Had been replaced, but I just kind of wanted to show what the inside of this looked like and all the work that had been done on it. And it kind of just gives you an idea as to the technology that was involved and a lot of the work that somebody did. Now, there's a couple of these guys here. My guess is they probably drifted a lot. I believe they're for some of the preamp settings, for the phono equalizer settings. I think that's what these guys are involved with. Overall, this is kind of what it looks like from the bottom. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the Paco putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and the gain is around 21 dB, and you can see that it is meeting its distortion requirements at better than 0.5% THD. The SNRs are anywhere from 63 dB for the right channel to about 55 for the left channel. Here we have the frequency response of the Paco from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, with it putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and the specification is plus or minus 1 dB. So we're kind of there with the right channel, but the left channel isn't quite doing so well at the high end of the band where it's down maybe 2 dB. And this is after I have tweaked the bass and treble controls a little bit to try to flatten out the response. This plot shows what happens when you flip the contour on, and basically it boosts the bass by a dB or two. And here is the frequency response when the rumble control is switched in. Here we have the Paco putting out a little over 20 watts into 8 ohm loads, and you can see that for the right channel we would be meeting the 0.5% THD or better, and for the left channel we're at about 0.9%. And so at least at 1 kilohertz we're just failing the THD for the left channel. The SNRs are around 56 to 58 dB, and the THD plus noise is around minus 41 dB or minus 47 dB for the right channel. I have adjusted the volume control so that we have a little over 20 dB of gain. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the Paco putting out about 5 watts into 4 ohm loads, and it's meeting its THD requirement of better than 0.5%. The SNRs are in the mid 50 dBs, and the THD plus noise is around minus 46 to minus 47 dB, and the volume control was adjusted such that we have almost 19 dB of gain. Here we have the frequency response of the Paco with it putting out 5 watts into 4 ohm loads. It should be plus or minus a dB, and on the left channel at the high end of the band we're maybe plus 1.4 dB. The right channel probably meets that requirement, I would say, but the left channel also has a problem at the low end of the band. And this is after I adjusted the bass and treble controls to try to flatten out the response. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the Paco putting out 17 watts into 4 ohms. Now, it should have better than 0.5% THD, and the left channel is a little bit above that at 0.65%, and then the right channel is a little bit below that at 0.4%. You can see that the SNRs are 55 for the right channel and about 60 for the left channel. You can see that the noise level of the right channel is higher than the left channel, which is down here, which kind of explains why the THD plus noise is higher on the right channel. And this is about the most power I could get without the THD hitting 1% for the left channel at least. This is a plot showing the output impedance of the Paco. It translates to a damping factor if I use the best case impedance, the lowest impedance for the right channel, of about 4. This plot shows the THD versus frequency for a couple different power levels, and those power levels are 18 watts into 4 ohms, 9.5 watts into 4 ohms, and 5 watts into 4 ohms. Basically, our THD is less than maybe 1.2% at the tail end of the band over here. Around the middle part of the band, it's less than 0.5%, and then as you start going lower in frequency, and our low limit is 30 hertz, we're up to close to 3% THD at the very low end of the band. This plot shows the crosstalk or isolation between the left and right inputs. In this case, I'm using the auxiliary 1 input, which I have been using for all the measurements so far. And the signal is going into the left channel and the right channel is terminated into a short. We're basically seeing about 40 dB of isolation here at the low end of the band. In the middle of the band, it's maybe a little bit better than 40, and at the high end of the band, it's maybe, I'll call it 30 dB down. So that kind of just shows the isolation of the two channels. I was not expecting much from the multi-tone testing, and if you look at the result here, you can see that at the very low end of the band, it doesn't have very much distortion-free range. Once you get to about maybe 200 or 300 hertz, you start getting maybe 6 bits of distortion-free range, and it gets a little bit better than that, maybe 7 or 8 bits as you get higher in frequency. But overall, that is not very good compared to today's modern amplifiers. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz of the phono 1 input to the tape monitor output. In this case, we're putting in a 5 millivolt signal into the phono 1 input, which would be a moving magnet input, just like the phono 2 input is. We are showing a gain of around 42 dB. The left channel THD is less than 0.05%, and the right channel's THD is about 0.1%. SNRs are around 53 dB, and the THD plus noise is around minus 52 dB. I should point out that I'm using this RIAA weighting factor. If I remove that, let me go ahead and turn it off, you'll see it add a slope to it, and I usually keep that on for photograph measurements. This is the frequency response of the phono 1 input to the tape monitor output with a 5 millivolt signal applied. And it does have the RIAA weighting applied to it, and if this were a perfectly flat frequency response with the weighting on, you would see a flat line across 0 here, but that is not the case. In fact, at the low part of the band, we're almost, we'll call it 2.6 dB, and at the high end of the band, we're maybe a half a dB. So actually, once you get down to maybe 200 hertz right here, the frequency response is better than 0.8 dB, and that's not really that bad for a phono section. Now this is to the tape monitor output. So at the low frequencies, it is not the best frequency response there. Overall, I think the Paco did a decent job of meeting its over 60-year-old specifications. The frequency response was not stellar, and this thing likes to hover around 1% THD when you're hitting the maximum power around 17 to 20 watts depending on which load you have. Some of the frequency response poorness may be attributed to these ceramic LRC packages that are in the preamp stage. I think I read on some of the forums where they remove them and replace them with either individual components or just bypass them altogether. That was not done, which I thought was a little surprising, since the person who Ian got this from had gone through and upgraded most of the power supply and capacitors in the audio chain and had not done anything with those ceramic boxes. They also put in that resistor that they shouldn't have in the power supply, but so they kind of knew what they're doing, or maybe they read something here and there, but I believe there are some tips about replacing those ceramic packages. That being said, I will point out that Ian did enjoy using this with his phono, which was surprising to me. He does have it hooked up to a pair of Altec 19s, and it sounds really good. They don't require much power. For my listening test, I hooked the Paco up to my Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 loudspeakers, which are pretty much a 4-ohm speaker of decent efficiency. And I will say that there is the standard kind of hum that you would hear, the 60 hertz hum. Just when it's sitting there idling, it doesn't really become a factor once music is playing. And even there idling, it's not really that objectionable at all. But you can hear it. Once you get a few feet away, it really disappears though. That being said, I thought it sounded okay once I got the volume up to a little bit more than halfway on the volume control with the source that I was using. I like to analogize cars and audio because I think there's a lot of commonalities, but it's kind of like you have a 4-barrel carburetor and you're driving along just using 2 of the barrels, and then you decide to punch it up a little bit, and those other 2 barrels open up, and the car just runs a lot better. And that's kind of the way I felt with the Paco. Once I got up to where I was hitting 78, 80 dB SPLs, and I was probably a couple notches past the halfway point on the volume control, I thought it sounded decent. Now, I don't think it would be an amplifier I would use for my reference system, and you certainly cannot crank it up very loud with the speakers like the Wilsons without distortion occurring. I didn't reach that level, but overall, once it got to a decent volume, I thought it sounded much better, and I would have no trouble listening to it for a lot of just normal everyday listening. So that being said, I think it's kind of a nice amp, and hopefully we'll have a picture of it in the case, which I will show right now if I do get the picture. So overall, I think the Paco SA-40 is a nice little amp to have for certain uses, and I'm sure Ian will enjoy using it. And hopefully no more tubes blow up that are only replaceable with rewiring. Anyway, if you have not subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. And until next time, have a great day or night.